G'day lads. For the final time, hopefully, I'm attempting to make a video which explains to some extent the reasons behind why Australia's T20 team has suddenly become awful, or so it would seem. Before we continue, I would just like to point out I have made a similar video to this in the past, focusing on the players themselves and the Big Bash. That is going to become a small part of this video. However, I'm going to look at individual series themselves and give a more broad analysis. I don't think this topic is something which you need to look into specific facts and like perfect stats. I think you can literally skim the face of it and come away with an in-depth understanding of what is going on, based off conditions, based off personnel, and other factors impacting this team. And I'd also like to say my dog is behind me. He's a little bit nervous right now. I don't entirely know why. So if there are any disturbances, put it down to him. Now, this so-called run of Australian losses has extended all the way back to the Australian Tour of England in mid-2020. And however, there is a marked difference between some of these tours and the recent debacles that we are witnessing. Australia could have easily won this series 2-1. In the first match, Australia restricted England to 162 for 7, and in reply were 1 for 124 of 14.1 overs for an almighty collapse, so Australia fall short by 2 runs. This was a damn good Australian team in this Tour of England. The lineup for this first match was Warner, Finch, Smith, Maxwell, Stoinis, Carey, who made 1 off 5, surprise, Ashton Agar, Pat Cummins, Mitchell Starc, Kane Richardson, who's not as bad as people think, and Adam Zampa. That is probably Australia's best T20 lineup. And to gain a creditable 2-1 loss away from home in England in the midst of a pandemic is not a bad result. We had no real time to acclimatise to the conditions, and it was a very difficult tour against one of the best T20 teams. Away from home, I would consider that an acceptable result. India's tour to Australia was also of similar quality. Australia lost the T20 series 2-1, and the matches went as follows. India made 161 for 7, and Australia replied with 150 for 7. The second T20 to Australia make a rollicking 194 for 5, before India made 195 for 4 off 19.4 overs. Australia then salvaged a consolation win in the final T20, with scoring 186 for 5, and India made 174 for 7. And I'd just like to have a look at this lineup, as it is not Australia's best T20 lineup, but there are still some stars playing in this game. Australia's lineup in the final T20 was Matthew Wade, Aaron Finch, Stephen Smith, Glenn Maxwell, Moses Enriquez, Darcy Short, Daniel Sams, Sean Abbott, Andrew Tye, Mitchell Swepson, and Adam Zampa. A decent lineup in itself. We were missing some stars with the ball, but bowling is Australia's strength. Bowling is not an area where we are significantly hindered. We are hindered by the loss of Starc, Cummins and Hazlewood, but it is not to the extent of the batting losses which Australia has faced. And that is a massive point I'm trying to get at here. Australia has basically been playing with one hand behind its back for much of this so-called dry spell. Australia has been playing T20 games with its B batting lineup. Let's be real here. I strongly doubt Australia would be embarrassed as much as it is if the T20 lineup for the series in both Bangladesh and the West Indies included Finch, Warner, Smith, Labuschagne, Maxwell, Stoinis, even Darcy Short and other players. If people like that were actually included, I seriously doubt Australia would be hammered in the way they have. I'm not saying we would win, but I'm saying there is a significant correlation between the poor performances and the lack of Australia's first-team stars being available with the bat. Because there is significant evidence for this in the games recently as well. In general, Australia have been far better with the ball than with the bat. We've seen that in both Bangladesh games, where Australia have collapsed pitifully with Mitch Marsh, the only batter capable of making runs, before Stark, Hazelwood and Zampa and Agar essentially gave Australia an unlikely chance of victory in both games versus Bangladesh. And then let's move on to New Zealand, the third tour. Again, this is where the problems start. Australia has been playing for much of this series with their hands behind their back. Lacking our best batters, we have consistently struggled to beat teams away from home. And that is another point I will get onto at the end of the video. Our lineup for the final T20 international, in which Australia was demolished by New Zealand, this is the first T20 international, I apologise, was Matthew Wade opening the batting, Aaron Finch, Josh Philippe, Mitchell Marsh, Glenn Maxwell, Marcus Stoinis, Ashton Agar, Daniel Sams, Jai Richardson, Kane Richardson and Adam Zampa. In this instance, Australia was missing players all over the park. Where is Stark, Cummins and Hazelwood, I might add? Obviously at home in Australia, not on the tour. The guns of Smith and Warner and Labuschagne to some extent, who has proven he is a capable all-rounder at T20 level, are simply not involved in this series. And that is the major problem. Australia is playing teams who are playing their full-strength 11s with our essentially second 11s. And what do you expect? The Big Bash in the competition itself probably deserves a full analytical video. However, Jared Kimber has already done it, so I'll leave the work to him. The Big Bash simply doesn't develop talent like it used to. And we are expecting Australia's B team players to come out and dominate like the IPL does. Pardon me, the Big Bash simply does not produce talent in a way that the IPL does. To ask these Australian B teams to win away from home with a nation that practically doesn't care is very difficult. And to add to that point, some of you might be saying, how can you say that Australia doesn't care about these T20 games? There's lots of people paying attention. There simply isn't. If you look at the cold, hard evidence based on the public perception from people I've talked to and the media itself, these series have essentially been out of sight, out of mind for the majority of Australia's sport-loving public. As I stated in an Instagram story, which you can still view by the time this will have gone out, journalists and the media simply don't care. A well-funded and widely listened to radio broadcast in Western Australia called 6PR gave the T20 series one sentence in their 8:30 news bulletin. One sentence. The Olympics got several minutes. You can tell what Australia's priorities are right now. Cricket is literally in the back seat. It is not what we are focusing on right now. And that cannot be a positive mindset for the players when they know that they are away from home, they are struggling, and the broader Australian public simply does not care. I'd also like to add that Australia has been exposed on this tour playing against spinning wickets. Repeatedly, we have seen with the success of Bangladesh's spinners and also the brilliant Hayden Walsh Jr., Fabian Allen and Akeal Hussain, these Australian liners are struggling on spin-friendly pitches. And that is something which I think could be righted if Australia had their full deck. Maxwell, Smith, Labuschagne and Warner to a lesser extent are all capable players against spin. And it is not like these guys from our B team have had strong experience against spin. The best spinner in Australia's Big Bash League competition last year from Australia was Peter Hatzeglu, who everyone loves as a bit of a meme, but once he started playing ODI domestic cricket, he has taken no wickets and conceded over 200 runs at an economy rate of over 7. Now, I'm not saying Peter is bad. He might turn around and become the GOAT, but there simply isn't a high-quality spin bowling depth in Australia's T20 scene. And when we go overseas and play good to great spinners on turning wickets, we are going to get exposed. And I think that's all I have to say. There are a number of factors which alleviate how this run isn't as bad as it may seem, such as the mental health of the players themselves, realising that they are playing games when their home public simply does not care. The fact they are playing on pitches which they are simply unprepared for, against a quality of bowlers they simply would not have faced. And finally, the fact that they are missing up to 6 or 7 first draw picks in all departments, which would significantly add to this T20 team in terms of its depth and its quality. Cheers, lads.